The bodies stopped screaming 3 minutes before the Hellsing Organization received the call. Not stopped dying. Stopped screaming. Death had come to London's Southwark district with the efficiency of a surgical strike, and by the time the Metropolitan Police realized they were responding to a massacre rather than a disturbance, 18 vampires had been reduced to ash across 4 city blocks. The ghouls they'd created, 47 reanimated corpses that should have been shambling through the streets, never made it past their first breath. Something had burned them down to nothing before they could spread the infection. This was not an invasion. This was an extermination. The vampire covens that had thrived in London's shadows for 2 centuries felt it first. A sudden, irreversible silence where their youngest members had been. No psychic death screams, no final transmissions through blood bond connections. Just absence, as if those vampires had never existed at all. The older ones, the true undead who remembered when Alucard had last walked freely through their territories, recognized the signature of absolute destruction. But this wasn't Alucard. This was something that understood vampires from an entirely different evolutionary tree. By dawn, the Helsing Estate's Situation Room had compiled footage from 18 different CCTV cameras, and not one frame showed a clear face. What they showed instead was methodology. A dark figure moving through the Southwark underground with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Silver stakes through hearts, but not the ceremonial silver of vampire hunters. Industrial, machined, purpose-built. UV grenades that detonated with spectrum frequencies that reduced European vampires to ash in 2.3 seconds. And a sword, always the sword, that moved with the kind of muscle memory that only came from a lifetime of cutting through undead flesh. "Whoever this is," Integra Helsing said, studying the tactical breakdown her analysts had compiled. "They're not one of ours. Not Iscariot, not even Millennium's usual provocations." Walter C. Dornez adjusted his monocle, his elderly fingers scrolling through the autopsy reports from the vampire remains. The precision suggests military training, special forces perhaps, but the weaponry. This UV technology is decades ahead of anything Section 13 has developed. And the serum residue we found at 3 locations. He paused, frowning at the chemical analysis. It's designed to suppress vampire regeneration at the cellular level, not destroy. Suppress, as if the wielder needed to keep their own vampiric nature in check. Integra's eyes narrowed. A Dhampir? Or something that's learned to weaponize the condition? The implication settled over the room like frost. Somewhere in London, something that understood vampires from the inside was systematically dismantling their population with the efficiency of an industrial process. Not out of rage, not out of vengeance, out of function. And if the pattern held, they'd move into Westminster by nightfall. "Alucard," Integra said, not raising her voice. She never needed to. The shadows in the corner of the room didn't move so much as coalesce, reality bending around the space until the no-life king stood where emptiness had been. His red coat seemed to drink the fluorescent light, and his smile carried the weight of 500 years of amusement at human presumption. "You want me to find the tourist," Alucard said, his voice sliding through the air like a razor through silk. "The one who's been cleaning house in territories I haven't bothered with in decades. I want you to determine if they're a threat to Helsing's operations," Integra corrected. "And if they are, I want you to educate them about how we handle vampire politics in this city." Alucard's grin widened. "It's been so long since something new has come to play. Tell me, Walter, do the bodies show hesitation? Fear? Any sign that our visitor is conflicted about what they're doing?" Walter shook his head slowly. "Every kill is clean, professional. There's no rage, no excessive force, just extermination. as if vampires are simply a problem to be solved rather than monsters to be feared. Fascinating. Alucard's form began to dissolve back into shadow, but his voice lingered. I'll find them before they reach the noble district. It would be rude not to introduce myself to someone who's worked so hard to get my attention. He was gone before Integra could give the order to avoid unnecessary casualties. Not that it would have mattered. When Alucard decided something was interesting, the resulting entertainment usually left parts of London in need of significant reconstruction. Across the city, in a safe house that had belonged to a vampire nest 6 hours ago, Blade ejected the empty magazine from his Mach 11 and reloaded with practiced efficiency. The weapons had come through the dimensional fracture intact. The serum supply would last another 72 hours if he was conservative. After that, he'd need to synthesize more, and he had no idea if this world's chemistry would cooperate with his biology. The vampires here were wrong. Not wrong in the way Deacon Frost had been wrong, or the way the purebloods in Eastern Europe were wrong. These European vampires, operated on rules that didn't match anything in his decades of experience. They burned in UV light, yes. Silver killed them, yes. But their regeneration was obscene, their strength more than he'd calculated for, and the way they created ghouls from their victims suggested a viral component that his world's vampires didn't possess. And then there was the other thing. The presence he'd felt twice now, watching from distances that should have made observation impossible. Something old enough that it made the ancient vampires he'd fought feel like children playing dress-up. Something that wanted him to know it was watching. Blade checked the edge of his sword, noting the new chip near the hilt where he'd bisected something that had regenerated from decapitation in under 10 seconds. He'd had to stake it 17 times before it stopped moving. This world had different rules. Fine. He'd learned new rules before. The sword slid into its sheath with a sound like a promise being made. Somewhere in this city, there was a power structure. Vampires this organized didn't exist without leadership, without hierarchy, without someone at the top who thought they could control the monster population through politics and treaties and gentlemen's agreements. Blade had seen that story before. It always ended the same way. He'd just have to introduce himself and explain how things were going to change. Stories like this don't end in one world, and subscribing ensures you don't miss where the multiverse breaks next. Outside, London's night was just beginning, and the supernatural underworld was learning to fear the daylight hours for the first time in centuries. The Daywalker found his next target in Whitechapel, because of course the vampires would congregate where history had already soaked the streets in blood. The nest operated out of a renovated warehouse that the human owners believed was leased to a private security firm. Blade watched from a rooftop across the street as 3 vampires entered through the main entrance at 9 p.m., confident in their immortality, arrogant in their territorial control. They moved like aristocrats attending a social function rather than predators returning to their den. That arrogance would cost them their existence in approximately 4 minutes. Blade dropped from the rooftop, his boots hitting the pavement with barely a sound. The UV grenades went through the ground floor windows first, 3 simultaneous detonations that filled the warehouse interior with artificial sunlight. The screaming started immediately, that particular frequency of agony that vampires made when their cells began to combust from the inside out. He was through the door before the light faded. The first vampire, still smoldering, lunged with speed that would have caught any human hunter by surprise. Blade's sword took its head off mid-leap, and he was already moving to the second target before the body hit the ground. Silver stake through the heart, twist, extract. The creature tried to regenerate around the wound, flesh bubbling and reforming, but Blade had learned from the last encounter. He injected the Edta serum directly into the chest cavity and watched the regeneration fail, the vampire's body finally accepting death. The third one was faster. It hit him from the side with enough force to crack ribs on a normal human, driving him into a support pillar that buckled under the impact. Blade rolled with the momentum, bringing his sword up in a defensive arc that opened the vampire's throat. Not fatal, not for these things, but it bought him the 2 seconds he needed to draw his pistol and empty 4 silver nitrate rounds into the creature's skull. It dropped, twitching, and Blade staked it before it could recover. Silence returned to the warehouse, broken only by the sound of his own controlled breathing and the faint sizzle of vampire remains turning to ash. 3 more removed from the population. 3 more that wouldn't create ghouls, wouldn't spread infection, wouldn't pretend they were anything other than parasites feeding on humanity. Efficient, a voice said from the darkness above him. Brutal. Entirely lacking in style, but I suppose American pragmatism has its own charm. Blade's pistol was tracking the voice before the sentence finished, but there was nothing to aim at. Just shadows, and the distinct feeling that something was moving through those shadows in ways that physics shouldn't allow. "You've made quite the impression in 48 hours, the voice continued. And now it came from behind him. Blade spun, sword ready, but there was still nothing there. 18 vampires in Southwark, 7 in Camden, and now these 3 unfortunate souls who thought Whitechapel was still safe. Tell me, do you have a quota, or are you simply going to hunt until someone stops you?" "Show yourself," Blade said, his voice flat, professional. He dealt with vampires who played mind games before. They all ended the same way. The laughter that followed was rich, delighted, and completely unafraid. "Oh, I like you already. No posturing, no threats. Just a simple demand from someone who actually believes he can enforce it." The shadows inverted, reality folding in on itself, and suddenly there was a figure standing 10 feet away. Tall, dressed in red, with glasses that reflected Blade's image back at him in duplicate. The vampire, and it was absolutely a vampire, Blade's senses screamed it, wore a smile that suggested he found the entire world to be an elaborate joke designed for his personal entertainment. "I am Alucard," the vampire said, and the name carried weight that pressed against Blade's consciousness like a physical force. "No life king. Hellsing Organization's primary weapon. And you, little Dampier, are operating in my city without permission." Blade's tactical assessment took 1.2 seconds. Power signature, unprecedented. Threat level, extreme. Confidence, absolute. This wasn't a vampire pretending to be a king. This was something that had earned the title through centuries of being unkillable. "I don't ask permission to hunt monsters," Blade said, his sword still ready. "And I don't care what organization you work for. Vampires don't get to police themselves." Alucard's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed to multiply in the shadows. "Police ourselves? Oh, no, no, no. We don't police. We dominate. There's a difference. The vampires you've been killing, they're the unaffiliated trash. The ones who don't understand that this city belongs to Helsing, and through Helsing, to me. You've been doing pest control, and I appreciate the efficiency. But now you're going to meet my master, and she's going to explain how things work in London." "I've met plenty of vampires who thought they were in control," Blade said. "They all burned the same. Or did they?" Alucard's form seemed to ripple, shadows extending from his coat like living things. "Did they survive being staked through the heart, shot with blessed silver, decapitated, dismembered, burned to ash and scattered to the winds?" "Because I have, little hunter. I've survived everything the Catholic Church could devise over 500 years. I've drunk the blood of thousands. I've become death itself, wearing the face of a Romanian nobleman who was already a monster before he became a vampire." The shadows lunged, and Blade moved. but not fast enough. Tendrils of solidified darkness wrapped around his wrists, his ankles, lifting him off the ground with strength that made his previous targets look like children. He fought against them, muscles straining, but it was like fighting against the concept of restraint itself. Alucard stepped closer, his eyes glowing red behind the orange glasses. "You're strong, faster than any Dhampir I've encountered. Your weaponry is impressive, but you're not in Kansas anymore, little Daywalker, and the monsters here don't follow your rules." "Neither do I," Blade growled and triggered the UV grenade on his belt. The explosion of artificial sunlight filled the warehouse, and Alucard's scream was something between laughter and genuine pain as his physical form dissolved into shadow and smoke. The tendrils released Blade, who dropped into a combat stance, weapons ready. But when the light faded, Alucard was already reformed, standing 20 feet away, his red coat smoking slightly, but his smile unchanged. "Oh yes," Alucard said, his voice filled with genuine pleasure. "You'll do nicely. Come along now. Integra will want to meet you before I'm allowed to play properly." The shadows rose like a wave, and Blade's world went dark. Blade woke to the scent of gunpowder, old leather, and tea. His tactical assessment completed before his eyes opened. Hands unrestrained, weapons removed but within reach on a nearby table. No immediate threats in the room. Single exit behind him. Two presences ahead. One human, one decidedly not. He was seated in a chair that cost more than most of his safe houses, in an office that looked like it had been decorated during the Victorian era, and simply refused to acknowledge that time had moved on. "Good," a woman's voice said, crisp and utterly controlled. "You're awake." I was beginning to think Alucard had been too enthusiastic with the shadow transportation. Blade opened his eyes. The woman behind the desk wore glasses and a suit that spoke of old money and older authority. Her posture was military straight, her gaze sharp enough to cut, and her right hand rested casually near a pistol that looked custom-made and well-maintained. Everything about her presence said she was used to commanding rooms full of people who could kill her without effort and making them obey anyway. "Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingate's Helsing," she said, not offering her hand. "Director of the Hellsing Organization, and the person whose city you've been treating as your personal hunting ground. You are?" Blade. He didn't elaborate. Names had power, and he'd learned long ago not to hand out more information than necessary. "Just Blade." Integra's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "How American." "Very well, just Blade. You've killed 28 vampires in 72 hours, triggered a panic in London's supernatural community, and forced me to divert resources from actual threats to determine whether you're an asset or a liability. Explain yourself." Blade's eyes tracked to Alucard, who stood in the corner of the room like a shadow that had decided to temporarily pretend at solidity. The vampire was watching him with the intensity of a predator studying something that might actually be interesting prey. "I hunt vampires," Blade said flatly. "All vampires, everywhere. That's the explanation." "How refreshingly simple," Integra said, pulling a file from her desk drawer and opening it. "Except the vampires you've been killing were unaffiliated trash, the equivalent of street criminals in the supernatural hierarchy. Nuisances, certainly, but not threats to the general population. Meanwhile, the actual threats, the ones who would create armies of ghouls, who would slaughter entire neighborhoods, are still operating because you're too busy clearing out the bottom feeders to notice the real predators." "There are no bottom feeders," Blade said. "There are just vampires, and they all die the same." "Do they?" Integra's gaze locked with his, unflinching. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're a Dhampir, half-vampire yourself, lecturing me about the nature of monsters while you use vampire strength, vampire speed, and vampire healing to do your work. The only difference between you and them is that you've convinced yourself your parasitism has a higher purpose." Blade's jaw tightened. He'd heard this argument before, from vampire philosophers and humans who thought they understood the darkness. It didn't make it less irritating. "I don't drink human blood," he said. "No. You inject synthetic compounds to keep your vampire nature suppressed while using its benefits," Integra countered. "You're a weapon built from the same material as the targets you hunt. Which brings me to my point. I also employ a weapon built from vampire material. The difference is that my weapon operates under my command, follows rules, and serves a purpose beyond simple extermination." She nodded toward Alucard, who smiled with too many teeth. "You want me to work for you," Blade said. "It wasn't a question. I want you to understand the reality of supernatural politics before you destabilize a system that's kept London from becoming a ghoul-infested wasteland for the last 50 years, Integra said. The Hellsing Organization was founded to protect England from supernatural threats. We do that through intelligence, military force, and yes, by controlling the vampire population rather than trying to exterminate it entirely. Because for every vampire you kill, 3 more are created in territories where we lack oversight. That's the logic of people who've made deals with monsters, Blade said. I've seen how that ends. The monsters always win. Alucard laughed, a sound like broken glass in velvet. "Oh, I like him, Integra. He has the certainty of someone who's never met a true monster. Just fledglings and pretenders playing at damnation." "You're a vampire," Blade said, looking at Alucard directly. "You drink human blood. You're immortal through parasitism. That makes you a monster, regardless of whose leash you're wearing." "I am a monster," Alucard agreed, his smile widening. "I'm the monster that appears when humans fall so far into depravity that only something inhuman can stop them. I'm the weapon Integra Helsing aims at things that make ordinary vampires look like sheep. And you, little Dhampir, are so focused on your crusade that you haven't noticed the real threat closing in on this city." "Alucard," Integra said, a warning in her voice. "He should know," Alucard said. "If he's going to keep operating here, he should understand what's actually coming." Integra was silent for a moment, then sighed and pushed a photograph across the desk. Blade leaned forward, studying the image. A military officer in a Nazi uniform, smiling at the camera with the expression of someone who found war to be the greatest joke ever told. "Millennium," Integra said. "A battalion of Nazi vampires created during World War II through experimental processes we're still trying to understand. They've been dormant for decades, but recent intelligence suggests they're preparing for something, an attack, an invasion. We don't know the specifics yet, but when they move, London will burn." "Artificial vampires," Blade said, his tactical mind already processing the implications. "How many?" "Approximately 1,000 combat-ready vampire soldiers, supported by supernatural technology and commanded by fanatics who believe vampiredom is the next step in human evolution," Integra said. "This is what the Hellsing Organization exists to fight. This is why we maintain control over London's vampire population, because when Millennium comes, we need every asset, every resource, every weapon we can deploy." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You can continue your crusade and get yourself killed fighting a war you don't understand. Or you can temporarily set aside your absolutism and help us destroy an army that will create more vampires in a single night than you could kill in a decade." Blade looked at Alucard, then back at Integra. Every instinct he had screamed that working with vampires was a betrayal of everything he'd fought for. But the tactical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through hundreds of hunts, recognized a genuine threat when it was presented. "I don't work for vampires," he said finally, "but I'll work against a common enemy, temporarily. After Millennium's destroyed, we'll discuss what happens to your weapon." Alucard's laughter filled the room like smoke. Oh, this is going to be fun. The arrangement lasted exactly 16 hours before the Vatican decided to complicate it. Blade was in Helsing's armory, examining their weapons cache with the critical eye of someone who'd built his own arsenal from scratch and found most standard vampire hunting equipment inadequate. Their silver rounds were well crafted, their blessed weaponry genuine, but their UV technology was decades behind what he'd been using. He was in the process of explaining to a very patient Walter Dornez why their grenade design was inefficient when the alarms started screaming. "Perimeter breach," Walter said calmly, already moving toward the weapons rack with the speed of someone who'd been doing this far longer than his elderly appearance suggested. "Section 30 signature. Iscariot has sent someone." Iscariot? Blade pulled his sword from where it had been propped against the workbench, his instincts already shifting into combat mode. "The Vatican's supernatural hit squad," Walter explained, tossing him a weapon harness. "Led by a regenerator named Father Alexander Anderson. Fanatical, powerful, and absolutely convinced that anything with vampire blood in it deserves purification through blessed bayonets. That includes you, I'm afraid." Blade's jaw tightened. Religious zealots with supernatural powers. He'd dealt with that combination before, and it never ended diplomatically. The wall exploded inward, not metaphorically. The reinforced concrete and steel that made up Helsing Manor's exterior wall simply ceased to exist in a shower of blessed fire and sanctified destruction. Through the smoke came a figure that looked like God's personal executant, tall, blonde, wearing priest's robes, and a smile that suggested he found holy slaughter to be the highest form of prayer. "Amen!" Father Alexander Anderson's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction as he stepped through the hole he'd created. His hands bristled with blessed bayonets, each one glowing with sacred light. "I have come to cleanse this nest of heresy, and to send the abominations dwelling within to face the Lord's judgment." His eyes locked onto Blade, and his smile widened. "And what have we here? A half-breed, a dhampir, a creature born of sin, walking in mockery of God's natural order. The Vatican has watched you slaughter your way through London, monster, and we have deemed you an affront to the Almighty's design." "I'm not in the mood for a sermon," Blade said, his sword already moving into a defensive position. His tactical assessment was immediate and concerning. The priest moved wrong, his body language suggesting regenerative capabilities that put him somewhere between a vampire and something else entirely. "Then I shall keep my message brief." Anderson's arm snapped forward, and 3 bayonets flew through the air with the speed of bullets. Blade moved, his dhampir reflexes allowing him to dodge 2 and deflect the 3rd with his sword. The blade that struck his weapon hissed with holy energy, and he felt the contact through the steel like an electric shock. These weren't just blessed, they were designed to harm supernatural entities on a fundamental level. He closed the distance, his sword coming up in a strike that should have opened Anderson from shoulder to hip. But the priest moved with practiced grace, blocking with 2 bayonets crossed in an X pattern. Steel met steel with a sound like a church bell being struck, and Blade felt the impact resonate through his arms. Anderson was strong, stronger than human, possibly stronger than most vampires he'd fought. "You fight well for a mongrel," Anderson said, his voice joyful despite, or perhaps because of, the violence. "But skill means nothing against the righteous fury of the Lord. Amen." He exploded into motion, bayonets appearing in his hands faster than Blade could track, each one thrown with lethal precision. Blade moved through the assault like water, his decades of combat experience allowing him to read the patterns, dodge the trajectories, close the distance again. His sword opened a cut across Anderson's chest, deep enough to kill any normal human. Anderson looked down at the wound, then back up at Blade, his smile never faltering. "Is that all?" The flesh knitted itself back together in seconds, the torn priest's robe, the only evidence the wound had ever existed. "Regenerator," Blade said, his tactical mind shifting strategies. "You're not human anymore either." "I am a weapon of the Lord," Anderson roared, and suddenly he was holding two blessed swords that seemed to materialize from the sleeves of his robes, forged in his holy fire to destroy the children of Cain, and you, half-breed, are an abomination. He attacked with the fervor of a man who believed murder was a sacrament, his blades moving in patterns that spoke of centuries of martial tradition refined by the Catholic Church's most dangerous operatives. Blade met the assault, his own sword work a fusion of modern tactical training and the brutal efficiency of street-level vampire hunting. They were destroying the armory. Steel cut through weapon racks, blessed fire ignited ammunition stores, and their battle moved through Helsing Manor like a localized apocalypse. "Enough!" The word carried force that made both combatants pause. Integra Helsing stood in the doorway, her pistol aimed at Anderson's head, her expression carved from ice and absolute authority. "Father Anderson," she said, her voice clipped and formal, "you are on Helsing property without permission. You have caused extensive damage to our facilities, and you are attempting to kill someone under our temporary protection. Explain yourself before I order Alucard to demonstrate why the Vatican learned to call ahead before sending their attack dogs." Anderson's smile didn't fade, but his stance shifted slightly, acknowledging the threat. "Sir Integra, I might have known you would shelter another monster. Does your corruption know no bounds? First you leash the demon Alucard, and now you protect a Dhampir who carries the vampire curse in his very blood." "I protect England," Integra said coldly. "And right now, that means coordinating our resources against Millennium. Or did the Vatican not receive my intelligence reports about the Nazi vampire battalion preparing to assault London?" "We received them," a new voice said from behind Anderson. A younger priest stepped through the hole in the wall, his expression cautious but determined. Father Anderson was overly enthusiastic in his interpretation of the orders to investigate the Dhampir's presence. Anderson laughed, a booming sound that echoed through the damaged armory. "Overly enthusiastic. The boy makes it sound like a sin. But very well, Sir Integra. If you claim this half-breed serves the cause of destroying the Nazi filth, then I shall stay my hand. For now." He turned back to Blade, his smile sharp as his bayonets. "But know this, monster. When Millennium falls, the Vatican will return for you. We do not forget. We do not forgive. And we most certainly do not allow abominations to walk freely simply because they hunt other abominations." "Get in line," Blade said flatly. Anderson's laughter followed him as he left through the hole he'd created, the younger priest offering an apologetic shrug before following. Integra holstered her pistol and surveyed the damage. "Walter, compile a repair estimate and send it to the Vatican. With interest." "Of course, Sir Integra," Walter said mildly. She turned to Blade. "You now have the attention of three major supernatural factions: Helsing, Iscariot, and Millennium. I hope your conviction is as strong as your combat skills, because things are about to become significantly more complicated." Blade sheathed his sword, checking the blade for damage from the blessed weapons. "Complicated I can handle. It's the simple stuff that usually kills you." The surveillance footage arrived at Helsing Manor exactly 3 hours after Anderson's departure, delivered via digital transmission that bypassed every firewall and security protocol Helsing's systems possessed. The message was clear. Millennium wanted them to see this. Blade stood in the Situation Room, watching the grainy video play across multiple screens. Walter had compiled reports. Integra chain-smoked in her chair, her expression carved from granite. And Alucard. Alucard watched with the kind of hunger that suggested he'd been waiting decades for this moment. The footage showed a cargo ship docking in Dover, then another in Portsmouth, a third in Bristol, all within the same 6-hour window, all registered to dummy corporations that dissolved upon investigation, all carrying cargo containers that the dock workers would later describe as moving from the inside. Millennium's advance forces, Walter said quietly. They're not waiting for a coordinated assault. They're already here. How many? Blade asked, his tactical mind already calculating vectors, choke points, civilian population densities. Conservative estimate, 300 artificial vampires spread across southern England. Aggressive estimate, 500, with more arriving daily. Walter's fingers moved across the keyboard, bringing up a map dotted with red markers. They're avoiding direct confrontation, staying in smaller towns and rural areas, creating ghouls, building armies, establishing territorial control before moving on London proper. Blade studied the pattern. It was smart. Avoid the major supernatural powers, build overwhelming numerical advantage, then strike when victory was inevitable. Classic military doctrine adapted for vampire warfare. They're testing us, Integra said, crushing out her cigarette and immediately lighting another. Seeing how we respond, whether we can coordinate our resources effectively. Or they're testing him, Alucard said, his eyes gleaming red as he looked at Blade. The Daywalker, the Dampier who killed 28 vampires in 72 hours. Millennium studies its enemies, little hunter. They've watched you work, analyzed your methods, and now they're wondering, can you adapt to fighting an army instead of individual targets? I've fought groups before, Blade said. Have you fought 1,000 artificial vampires backed by Nazi occult technology and commanded by officers who've been planning this invasion for half a century? Walter asked gently. Because that's what's coming, Mr. Blade. Not street-level vampires hiding in warehouses, not uncoordinated fledglings. A military force that views supernatural warfare as a science to be perfected. The screens flickered and new footage appeared. This time, the quality was pristine. Professional-grade military camera work showing a burning village somewhere in the English countryside. Bodies littered the streets, some rising as ghouls, others simply dead. And standing in the center of the carnage was a figure in a Millennium uniform, staring directly at the camera with eyes that reflected too much light. Greetings, Hellsing Organization, the vampire on screen said in accented English. And greetings to our new American friend, the Daywalker, the half-breed who thinks he can save humanity from the monsters. He smiled, revealing fangs. We are First Lieutenant Rip Van Winkle, and we bring a message from the Major. London will fall, your queen will kneel, and your pathetic resistance will be remembered only as a footnote in the glorious new age of vampire supremacy. The image cut to black, then switched to aerial footage of another town, this one larger, with a population in the thousands. The streets were already filling with ghouls. That's reading, Walter said, his voice tight. 40 miles from London, population 60,000. They're forcing our hand, Integra said. We respond to reading. We leave London vulnerable. We ignore reading. They create an army large enough to march on the capital with overwhelming force. Then we split our forces, Blade said. I'll handle raiding. The room went silent. Alucard's smile widened into something that might have been respect or might have been anticipation of watching Blade fail spectacularly. You want to face potentially 50 artificial vampires and several thousand ghouls alone, Integra said flatly. That's not confidence, Mr. Blade. That's suicide. I've cleared nests with worse odds, Blade said, already running calculations. UV saturation tactics, explosive ordnance, target prioritization. And you need Alucard here in case Millennium hits London while we're distracted. This is a basic flanking maneuver. They want you to commit your primary asset to one location so they can strike at another. He's right, Alucard said, sounding almost disappointed. The Major is many things, but stupid isn't one of them. This is theater, performance. They're establishing the playing field before the real war begins. He tilted his head, studying Blade with renewed interest. Though I am curious to see if our American friend can actually handle what he's volunteering for. I'm not volunteering, Blade said. I'm doing what I came here to do, kill vampires. Whether it's one in an alley or 50 in a town doesn't change the methodology. Integra studied him for a long moment, then made her decision with the decisiveness of someone who'd been commanding life-or-death operations since she was 12 years old. Walter, prepare transport for Mr. Blade. Full armory access. He'll need everything we can provide. Ceres Victoria will accompany him as backup and to provide intelligence reports. The police girl? Alucard's smile took on a cruel edge. Oh, this will be educational for her. I work alone, Blade said immediately. Not in my organization, you don't, Integra countered. Ceres is a vampire, yes, but she's also a skilled soldier who understands modern combat tactics. She'll provide fire support and ensure you don't do something heroically stupid like getting yourself killed in the first 5 minutes. Consider it non-negotiable. Before Blade could argue, the door opened and a young woman in a Hellsing uniform entered. Blonde, nervous energy barely contained, with red eyes that marked her as freshly turned. She saluted Integra with military precision, though Blade noticed the way her hand trembled slightly. You wanted to see me, Sir Integra? Officer Victoria, you'll be accompanying Mr. Blade on a field mission to Reading. Millennium forces are entrenched there. Your objective is to eliminate the vampire presence and contain the ghoul outbreak before it spreads to neighboring population centers. Ceres Victoria's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't hesitate. Yes, Sir Integra. When do we deploy? 30 minutes, Integra said. Walter will brief you on the situation. Mr. Blade will explain his tactical approach on the way. Try not to get killed. We're already short-staffed as it is. As Ceres saluted again and left to prepare, Blade turned to Integra. If she gets in the way, she won't, Integra said. Ceres Victoria might be young by vampire standards, but she was a police officer before Alucard turned her. She understands duty follows orders and won't freeze when the shooting starts. Which is more than I can say for most of the artificial vampires you're about to face. Alucard's laughter followed Blade out of the situation room, a sound like promises of violence wrapped in amusement. The drive to Reading took 45 minutes, and Blade spent the first 30 of them in silence, checking weapons and running tactical scenarios, while Ceres Victoria drove the armored transport with the focused intensity of someone trying very hard not to think about what they were driving toward. She broke first. So, you hunt vampires? Yes, Blade said, not looking up from the silver stakes he was arranging in precise rows across his tactical vest. But you're part vampire yourself? Yes. And you've been doing this for how long? Long enough. He loaded a magazine with silver nitrate rounds, tested the weight, loaded another. The familiar ritual of preparation was the only thing keeping his instincts from screaming about working alongside a vampire, even a young one who still carried herself like the police officer she'd been. Ceres was quiet for a moment, navigating around an abandoned car on the motorway. The roads had been cleared by police once the Reading situation became apparent, but evidence of panicked evacuation littered the shoulders. Suitcases, personal belongings, the detritus of people fleeing for their lives. Master, Alucard, he said you have interesting opinions about vampires, she said carefully. That you think we should all be destroyed. No exceptions. Blade finally looked at her. You drink blood? Yes. You're immortal through parasitism. I suppose that's one way to put it. Then you're a vampire, and vampires are predators wearing human faces. The fact that you're polite about it doesn't change what you are. Ceres's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles going white. I didn't choose this. I was dying. Alucard gave me a choice between death and this. I still protect people. I still follow orders. I still believe in right and wrong. Doesn't that count for anything? It counts for you being a vampire who tries to be a good person, Blade said. But history is full of monsters who thought they were doing the right thing. The question isn't what you believe, it's what you'll become in 10 years, 50, 100. When everyone you knew as human is dead and you're still walking around drinking blood to survive. Then why are you working with Helsing? Seras shot back, her voice harder now. Why help an organization that uses vampires as weapons if you think we're all doomed to become monsters? Because Millennium is a bigger threat right now, Blade said simply. After they're destroyed, we'll see what happens. You mean you'll try to kill Alucard? It wasn't a question. I mean, I'll do what I've always done. Remove the vampire threat. All of it. Seras was quiet for a long moment, then laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You're going to try to kill the no-life king, the vampire who's survived 500 years of vampire hunters, military strikes, and the Catholic Church's best assassins. Good luck with that. I don't need luck, Blade said. I need the right weapon and the right opening. Everything dies if you hit it hard enough in the right place. The outskirts of Reading appeared through the windscreen, or what was left of them. The streetlights were out, fires burned in several buildings, and the roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles. But it was the silence that was most disturbing. A town of 60,000 people should have had ambient noise, traffic, the background hum of civilization. Instead, there was nothing but the sound of their engine and the distant screaming that suggested some civilians hadn't escaped after all. Contact, Seras said, her voice shifting into professional soldier mode. Movement in the streets, multiple signatures, at least 30 ghouls visible, probably more in the buildings. Blade's tactical HUD, a set of specialized glasses he'd modified years ago, painted the scene in thermal overlay. She was right. The ghouls shambled through the streets in packs, hunting for survivors. And behind them, coordinating their movements with military precision, were the artificial vampires. He counted 8 in immediate visual range. Based on the pattern of ghoul distribution, probably 30 more spread throughout the town center. We need to draw them into a kill zone, Blade said, already formulating the plan. Ghouls are secondary targets. They're not the plague vector. The artificial vampires are creating them. We remove the vampires, the ghoul threat stops growing. How do you want to handle it? Seras asked, pulling the transport into cover behind a concrete barrier. Master usually just walks in and slaughters everything, but I'm guessing you have a more structured approach. I'm going loud, Blade said, loading his weapons with practiced efficiency. UV grenades to clear the initial wave, then systematic elimination of vampire targets. You provide overwatch and fire support. Any artificial vampires that break for civilian areas, you intercept and contain. Don't try to match me pace for pace. Just maintain the perimeter and keep them from organizing a coordinated response. Seras pulled her massive Harkonnen cannon from the equipment rack, a weapon that looked like it belonged on a tank rather than in human hands. And if they do organize? Then we adapt, Blade said. But they won't. Millennium's artificial vampires are soldiers, not warriors. They follow doctrine, execute plans, and rely on their numbers. That makes them predictable. He opened the transport door, and the smell of death rolled in. Rot, decay, and the distinct copper tang of blood spilled in industrial quantities. Somewhere in the town center, a child was crying. The sound cut off abruptly. Stay sharp, Blade said. And remember, you might be a vampire, but you're also a soldier. Act like one. He moved into the street, his sword in one hand and a UV grenade in the other. The first pack of ghouls noticed him immediately, their dead eyes focusing with the single-minded hunger of reanimated corpses. They charged, and Blade let them come, counting seconds, measuring distance, waiting for the optimal moment. The UV grenade detonated in the center of the pack. 15 ghouls turned to ash before they could close half the distance. The rest faltered, their coordination broken, and Blade was among them with his sword, each strike precise and fatal. Decapitation was simpler with ghouls. They didn't regenerate like true vampires. Behind him, the Harkonnen cannon roared, and a building 3 blocks away exploded as Seras engaged targets he couldn't see. Her positioning was good, elevated, clear sight lines, far enough back to provide cover fire without getting pulled into close combat. Then, the artificial vampires responded. They came from multiple directions simultaneously, moving with military coordination that spoke of training and tactical awareness. 8 became 16 as hidden reinforcements emerged from buildings. 16 became 24 as more appeared from underground positions. Blade's HUD painted them all in thermal overlay, calculating threat vectors and optimal engagement patterns. Too many for frontal assault. He needed to break their formation, force them into smaller groups where his speed and experience gave him the advantage. He triggered 2 more UV grenades, throwing them into the vampire formation. The explosions bought him 3 seconds as they scattered, and he used those seconds to close on the nearest target. A female artificial vampire who moved with the confidence of someone who'd been told she was immortal. His sword took her head off before she could prove otherwise. The battle for Reading had begun. The artificial vampires learned quickly that frontal assault was suicide. Blade moved through Reading's streets like a force of nature, his decades of experience translating into a rhythm of destruction that left ash and ichor in his wake. UV grenades forced dispersal, silver stakes ended regeneration. His sword opened throats and severed limbs with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed these exact motions 10,000 times before. But they adapted. That was the difference between mindless fledglings and military-trained artificial vampires. They learned from watching their comrades die. The attacks shifted from direct engagement to ambush tactics, sniper positions from rooftops with stolen police firearms, coordinated flanking maneuvers using ghouls as screening forces. One vampire even attempted a suicide charge with military explosives strapped to its chest, betting that Blade's Dampier physiology wouldn't survive the blast radius. It wouldn't have worked. Blade had sensed the trap and put 2 ghouls between himself and the explosion, but the fact they were willing to sacrifice their own meant Millennium's conditioning ran deep. "Blade, you've got a problem!" Seras's voice crackled through the radio headset Walter had insisted he wear. "Large force moving in from the east, at least 40 ghouls with vampire support. They're trying to flank you." Blade dropped behind an overturned car as rifle fire stitched across the position he'd occupied a second before. His tactical assessment was immediate. He was being herded. The artificial vampires had stopped trying to kill him directly and started using territory control to limit his options. Smart. Ineffective against someone who'd fought in worse conditions, but smart. "Can you intercept?" he asked, loading a fresh magazine. "Negative. I'm pinned down by 2 vampires with anti-materiel rifles. They're staying at range, keeping me from repositioning." Frustration colored her voice. "I'm sorry. I should be—" "You're doing fine," Blade cut in, surprising himself with the honesty. "Hold your position and keep them from organizing. I'll handle the flank." He moved before Seras could respond, using the burning buildings as cover, his enhanced senses tracking the approaching force through sound and scent. 40 ghouls meant at least 3 artificial vampires directing them. Standard Millennium squad composition based on what he'd observed. Remove the vampires, the ghouls became disorganized prey. The ambush came from above. 3 artificial vampires dropped from the second-story windows simultaneously, their coordination perfect, their attack vectors calculated to give him no angle of escape. Blade's sword took the first one across the chest. Not fatal, but it bought him the split second needed to dodge the second vampire's knife thrust. The third landed behind him, blade already moving toward his spine. He spun, catching the attack on his reinforced coat, and drove his elbow into the vampire's throat hard enough to crush the windpipe. It wouldn't kill something that didn't need to breathe, but the momentary disruption gave him space to draw a silver stake and ram it through the sternum. The vampire's eyes went wide with shock, not pain, shock, as its regeneration failed and death finally claimed it. "Impossible," it whispered in German-accented English. "You're just a Dampir. You shouldn't be this fast." Blade twisted the stake. "I've had more practice." The other two vampires attacked together, having learned from their comrade's mistake. They kept moving, forcing Blade to track multiple targets, using their numerical advantage to probe his defenses. One wielded military combat knives with special forces training. The other had bare hands but struck with enough force to crack concrete. They were good, well-trained, experienced in working as a unit, confident in their enhanced abilities. Blade was better. His swordwork flowed between defensive parries and offensive strikes, each movement economical and brutally effective. When the knife wielder overextended, Blade's blade opened its throat. When the brawler tried to grapple, he broke its arm at the elbow and followed with a silver stake through the eye socket. Both vampires fell, twitching, and Blade didn't wait for them to finish dying. The ghoul force was seconds away, and fighting 40 reanimated corpses in the open would waste ammunition he'd need for the remaining vampires. He triggered the remote detonator on the explosive charges he'd been placing throughout his fighting retreat. The street erupted in sequential explosions, collapsing buildings onto the approaching ghoul horde and creating a wall of fire that would take them precious minutes to navigate. Not a permanent solution. Ghouls didn't fear fire the way living things did, but it bought him time. "Seras, status?" he asked, moving to higher ground. "I got one." Pride and relief colored her voice. The other broke contact when his partner went down. "I think they're regrouping." "Good. Get mobile and sweep for civilians. There are still survivors hiding in the residential areas." "What about you?" "I'm going to remove the head of this operation," Blade said, his enhanced senses finally tracking what he'd been hunting for since the battle started: the command presence. Every military unit had one, the officer coordinating tactics and adjusting strategy. He'd felt it directing the artificial vampires, pulling them back when they overcommitted, sending them forward when opportunities appeared. It was in the town hall 3 blocks north. Elevated position, clear sight lines, defensible. Exactly where he'd put a command post if he were running this operation. The approach was a shooting gallery. Open streets, minimal cover, every angle exposed to potential sniper fire. Blade moved anyway, using his speed to make himself a difficult target, his tactical awareness to track the vampires repositioning to intercept him. 2 appeared from a side street, moving to block his path. He didn't slow down. His sword took the first one's legs out from under it, and he staked it while still in motion. The second managed to land a hit, claws raking across his ribs hard enough to draw blood. But Blade's return strike separated its head from its body. The town hall's doors had been reinforced. Blade kicked them off their hinges. Inside, the lighting was dim, emergency power only. But his enhanced vision picked out every detail. The overturned furniture arranged as defensive positions, the weapons cache in the corner, the radio equipment still broadcasting orders in German to the remaining vampire forces. And standing in the center of the room, smiling with the confidence of someone who'd been expecting him, was a woman in a Millennium officer's uniform. She held an antique musket that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a battlefield. "Guten Abend, Herr Daywalker," First Lieutenant Rip Van Winkle said, her smile sharp. "I am so pleased you accepted me an invitation. The Major will be delighted to hear how you performed against our screening force." "Screening force," Blade repeated flatly, his tactical mind reassessing everything. The ambushes, the coordination, the willingness to sacrifice artificial vampires in probing attacks. They'd been testing him, measuring his capabilities, gathering intelligence on how he fought, how he adapted, what weaknesses he might have. "Yeah," Rip Van Winkle said. "Did you think Reading was a true offensive? Oh no, this was merely the audition. And you, Herr Blade, you have performed beautifully. Every tactic, every weapon, every limitation, all documented for our records." She raised the musket, and Blade's instincts screamed warning a split second before she fired. The bullet moved wrong, curving through the air, adjusting its trajectory mid-flight, tracking him as he dodged. It was following him, hunting him. He twisted, bringing his sword up, and the blade intercepted the bullet. The impact sent shockwaves through his arms, and the bullet ricocheted. But it curved again, coming back for a second pass. Magic. The bullet was enchanted, blessed, or both. "Der Freischütz," Rip Van Winkle said, her smile widening. "The magic bullet that never misses. You cannot dodge it. You cannot hide from it. It will hunt you until it finds your heart." The bullet came again, and this time, Blade was ready. He caught it on his reinforced coat, letting the impact spin him, and used the momentum to close the distance. His sword struck for her throat. She was already gone, her form dissolving into mist, reappearing 20 feet away. "Too slow, Dampier," she sang. "Far, far too slow." The magic bullet carved another trench across Blade's shoulder as he rolled behind a concrete pillar. His tactical assessment was clear and unforgiving. This wasn't a fight he could win through conventional means. The bullet tracked through solid objects, curved around obstacles, and possessed enough force to penetrate his reinforced coat. Meanwhile, Rip Van Winkle could phase through attacks and reposition at will. He needed to change the parameters. "You're analyzing," Rip Van Winkle called out, her voice lilting with amusement. "I can see it in how you move. Calculating angles, searching for weaknesses, trying to find the tactical solution. Very American, very practical. But some problems cannot be solved with planning, Herr Blade. Some things simply are." The bullet punched through the pillar, forcing him to move again. His shoulder wound was already healing, his Dampier regeneration working to knit torn muscle and seal damaged blood vessels. But every hit drained energy, pushed him closer to the threshold where he'd need another serum injection to keep his vampire nature suppressed. "Blade," Ceras's voice crackled through the headset. "I'm at your position. What do you need?" "Stay outside," Blade ordered. "The bullet tracks individual targets. 2 of us just means—" The town hall's wall exploded inward as Ceres Victoria drove the armored transport straight through the brick and mortar. She emerged from the driver's compartment, Harkonnen cannon leveled at Rip Van Winkle, her red eyes blazing with determination. "Sorry," Ceres said, not sounding sorry at all. "Master taught me that sometimes the best tactics is overwhelming firepower." She fired. The Harkonnen's discharge was less gunshot and more controlled artillery strike. The shell crossed the distance in milliseconds, and Rip Van Winkle's confident smile finally faltered as she dissolved into mist, but not fast enough. The explosion caught her partially materialized form, slamming her into the far wall with bone-crushing force. The magic bullet, temporarily without a master's focus, circled aimlessly in the air like a confused predator. "Now would be good," Ceres shouted, already loading another shell. Blade moved, crossing the distance while Rip Van Winkle was still recovering from the impact. His sword came down in an overhead strike that should have split her skull, but she flickered again, reforming 3 feet to the left, blood streaming from her mouth, her uniform torn. "Clever girl," she gasped, her smile returning despite the pain. "Using surprise and superior firepower to disrupt my concentration. The Major will enjoy reviewing this footage, but you have made one critical error." The magic bullet snapped back into focused flight, no longer targeting Blade but arrowing straight towards Ceres. Blade's tactical mind ran the calculations in microseconds: distance, velocity, trajectory. He couldn't intercept it, couldn't block it. The bullet was already past him, locked onto its new target, and Seras was standing in the open with no cover and nowhere to go. His hand found the UV grenade on his belt, armed it, and threw in a single fluid motion. Not at Rip Van Winkle, at the space between Seras and the incoming bullet. The grenade detonated mid-air, flooding the town hall with artificial sunlight. Rip Van Winkle screamed as her flesh began to smoke, her concentration breaking as she dove for shadow. And the magic bullet, passing through the UV burst at the exact moment of detonation, lost its enchantment. The magic unraveled under the artificial sun's purifying light, and what struck Seras's armor was just lead, painful, but not fatal. She stumbled back, gasping, and Blade was already moving toward Rip Van Winkle's position. The vampire lieutenant was trying to reform, her regeneration fighting against UV burns, her confidence finally replaced with something that looked like genuine concern. "Unmöglich," she whispered. "The magic cannot be." Blade's sword pierced her chest, finding the heart with practiced precision. But he didn't stop there, couldn't stop there, not with an artificial vampire whose regeneration capabilities were still unknown. The silver stake followed, driven through the same wound, pinning her to the floor. "Your bullet relied on magic," Blade said, kneeling to inject Edta serum directly into the wound. "Magic has rules. Rules can be broken. You should have just used a gun." Rip Van Winkle's eyes widened as her regeneration failed, as death finally came for her after whatever unholy process had made her into Millennium's weapon. "The Major," she whispered, blood bubbling at her lips. "He said you would be interesting. He was right. He is always right." Her body began to crumble, artificial vampire physiology failing without the magic and technology sustaining it. Within seconds, there was nothing left but ash and the smell of burnt ozone. Blade stood, his shoulder wound still healing, and turned to Seras. "Are you hurt? Bruised ribs, maybe cracked," she said, checking herself with professional efficiency. "The armor took most of it. That was a magic bullet, an actual magic bullet that never missed. How did you know the UV light would disrupt the enchantment?" "I didn't," Blade admitted. "But magic requires energy, and energy has to come from somewhere. UV light disrupts vampire cellular structure at the molecular level. I was betting it would interfere with whatever supernatural frequency the bullet operated on." "You bet?" Seras stared at him. "You threw your only UV grenade on a bet?" "It worked." "What if it hadn't?" Blade looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then you would have died, and I would have killed her anyway. But I had a higher probability of disrupting the magic than you had of surviving a hit from a bullet that had already demonstrated penetration capability against supernatural targets." Seras was quiet for a moment, then laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "Master was right. You are absolutely mental. But thank you for the save." "Don't thank me yet," Blade said, moving to the radio equipment. "This was a screening force, remember? Millennium now has detailed intelligence on both of us. They know our capabilities, our tactics, our equipment. And they sacrificed an officer and 40 artificial vampires to get it." He studied the radio logs, his enhanced vision passing through the German transmissions. Most of it was tactical chatter, position reports, casualty notifications. But one message, repeated on a secured frequency, sent immediately before Rip Van Winkle's death. "Phase 1, complete. Subject assessment favorable. Proceeding to Phase 2. London offensive green-lit." "We need to get back to Helsing Manor," Blade said, his voice tight. "Now." "What's wrong?" "Everything. This entire operation was bait. They wanted us here, away from London, gathering intelligence while their main force..." The radio crackled to life with Integra's voice, sharp and controlled, despite the chaos Blade could hear in the background. All Hellsing forces, Code Black. I repeat, Code Black. Millennium is attacking London with full force, multiple breach points across the city. Estimated enemy strength, 800 plus artificial vampires. We are officially at war. Blade was already moving toward the transport, Ceras close behind. Reading was secured. The remaining artificial vampires would scatter without command structure, and the ghouls would be dealt with by conventional military forces once daylight came. But London was burning, and the real battle was just beginning. "How long to get back?" he asked as Ceres gunned the engine. 45 minutes if I ignore every traffic law and physics." "Do it." The transport roared out of Reading's ruins, leaving ash and silence behind. Somewhere ahead, London was learning what happened when Nazi vampires decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. And somewhere in the chaos, Millennium's Major was watching, smiling, and preparing for the next act of his carefully orchestrated war. London was dying when they arrived. The transport crested the hill overlooking the city, and Blade's tactical assessment shifted from professional analysis to something closer to disbelief. He'd seen vampire attacks before, nest clearances, territorial wars, even organized covens attempting coordinated strikes. But this was something else entirely. This was military invasion executed with industrial efficiency. Zeppelins hung over the city like mechanical nightmares from an alternate history, their bellies open and disgorging artificial vampires by the hundreds. The creatures dropped into the streets with parachutes bearing the swastika, landing in coordinated formations that immediately began systematic slaughter. Tracer fire lit the night sky as British military forces engaged, but conventional weapons were having minimal effect against targets that regenerated from everything except catastrophic damage. "Jesus Christ," Ceres whispered, her hands tight on the steering wheel. "There's so many." Blade was already calculating. 800 artificial vampires spread across a city of 8 million people. If each vampire created even 10 ghouls before being destroyed, London would have an army of the undead numbering in the tens of thousands within hours. And these weren't mindless fledglings. They were trained soldiers executing a battle plan with military precision. "Take us to Helsing Manor," he said. "We need to—" The radio crackled with Walter's voice, strained but controlled. "All units, Helsing Manor is under siege. 50+ artificial vampires have breached the perimeter. Sir Integra has activated Protocol 7. I repeat, Protocol 7 is active." "What's Protocol 7? Blade asked. Ceras's face had gone pale. "It means Alucard is released with zero restrictions, no holding back, no mercy. Sir Integra only uses it when the situation is beyond desperate." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Blade's enhanced senses caught something that made his tactical instincts scream warning. A presence, vast and ancient, unfurling across London like a wave of predatory intent. It wasn't subtle, it was announced, a declaration to every supernatural creature in the city that something older and far more dangerous than Millennium's artificial vampires had just entered the battlefield. "He's hunting," Ceres said quietly. "Master's really hunting." The transport's radio switched frequencies on its own, and Alucard's voice filled the cabin, rich with anticipation, dark with hunger, and carrying an undertone of genuine joy that was somehow more disturbing than rage would have been. "Integra, my master, I have a request." His voice was silk over razors. "These Nazi dogs have brought war to your doorstep. They've invaded your city. They've threatened your country. And they've done it all with imitation vampires, pale copies of true undead created through technology rather than the honest corruption of the soul. Make your request, Alucard." Integra's voice responded, steady despite the gunfire audible in the background. "I wish to engage in slaughter, not the surgical elimination I usually perform, not the measured violence you typically require. I want to remind London why vampires were feared before humans learned to make pale shadows of our power in laboratories. There was a pause. Then Integra's response. Approved. Show Millennium what a true monster looks like. And Alucard, leave some for Mr. Blade. He's earned the right to participate. Alucard's laughter rolled across the radio frequency like thunder. Oh, I wouldn't dream of denying our American friend his entertainment. Let's see if the Daywalker can keep pace with a real vampire. The transmission cut, and moments later, the screaming started. Not from civilians, from the artificial vampires. Blade watched through the transport's windscreen as something impossible happened 3 blocks away. A Millennium squad of 20 artificial vampires, moving in tactical formation toward a civilian shelter, simply ceased to exist. No explosion, no visible attack. They were there one moment, and the next, there was only Alucard, standing in the center of their formation, with his arms spread wide and his smile visible even at this distance. The shadows around him were moving wrong, extending like hungry things, reaching for the next group of artificial vampires with predatory intent. He's not just killing them, Sarah said, her voice carrying a mix of awe and horror. He's consuming them, taking their existence into himself. Blade had seen many vampires fight. He'd studied their tactics, learned their patterns, exploited their weaknesses. But watching Alucard move through Millennium's forces was like watching a natural disaster with malicious intent. The no-life king didn't dodge attacks. He absorbed them, let the artificial vampires empty their weapons into his body, and then reformed while their expressions shifted from confidence to terror. We need to find the command structure, Blade said, forcing his attention away from Alucard's rampage. This operation is too coordinated to be running without central control. There's a leader somewhere directing the invasion. The Major, Sarah said. He's Millennium's commander, but he'll be somewhere protected, probably on one of those Zeppelins. No. Blade's tactical mind was processing the attack pattern, the distribution of forces, the strategic objectives. He's here, on the ground. This isn't just an invasion. It's theater. Performance. He's watching because he wants to see the results of his work firsthand. His enhanced senses swept across the city, filtering through the chaos for something that felt wrong in a different way than the artificial vampires. They were manufactured threats, dangerous, but ultimately tools. He was looking for the hand wielding those tools. There, in the Parliament District, a concentration of power that felt more like a black hole than a presence, as if something was deliberately absorbing attention, creating a void where observation should naturally fall. I need to get there, Blade said, pointing toward Parliament. Drop me it. The transport's roof tore away like tissue paper. Blade looked up into the smiling face of a massive vampire. Easily 8 feet tall, his body a grotesque fusion of muscle and what looked like mechanical augmentation. The creature's uniform marked him as Millennium, but the sheer physical presence marked him as something far more dangerous than the standard artificial vampires. Guten Abend, the vampire said in a voice like grinding stone. I am Captain Hans Gunscher. The Major sends his regards and asks that you stop for a moment to appreciate his grand design before attempting to interrupt it. He dropped into the transport, his weight crumpling the roof supports, and his fist came down like a sledgehammer. Blade caught the blow on crossed forearms, and the impact drove him through the transport's floor and into the street beneath. Concrete cracked, his bones held, barely. The strength behind that strike was beyond anything he'd fought before, beyond even the ancient vampires who'd centuries to develop their power. Hans dropped through the hole he'd created, his smile never faltering. You are strong, Dampier. Good. The Major wishes me to properly test you before the finale. Blade rolled to his feet, drawing his sword, his ribs screaming protest from the impact. Behind Hans, he could see Ceres trying to reposition, but another massive vampire, identical to Hans, blocked her path. "My twin, Captain Luke Valentine," Hans said, noting Blade's tactical assessment. "He will ensure the young Fräulein Victoria does not interfere. You and I, Herr Blade, will have a proper conversation about strength." Hans Gunscher moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something his size. Blade's sword met the vampire's fist in a strike that sent shockwaves through both their bodies. The blade bit deep into reinforced flesh, deep enough to sever bone on a normal opponent. But Hans just smiled as his regeneration knitted the wound closed around the steel. His other hand came up in an uppercut that Blade barely dodged, the force of the missed strike creating a pressure wave that shattered windows in the surrounding buildings. "The Major selected us personally," Hans said, pressing the attack with systematic brutality. "We are not the mass-produced trash you have been slaughtering. We are werewolves, the Captain's special projects. Artificial vampires built to match true undead in capability." He wasn't boasting. Every strike carried enough force to crater pavement. His speed matched Blade's despite the size difference, and his regeneration was working faster than the Edta serum could suppress it. Blade had already landed 3 solid hits with silver-laced weapons, and Hans showed no signs of slowing. Blade shifted tactics. If overwhelming force wasn't working, he needed to use precision. He feinted high, drew Hans's guard up, then dropped low and drove his blade through the vampire's knee. The joint buckled, and Blade followed with a UV grenade placed directly against Hans's chest. The explosion should have ended it. The UV radiation should have burned through Hans's enhanced regeneration and reduced him to ash. Instead, Hans screamed, in rage, not agony, and backhanded Blade hard enough to send him through a car. The vampire's chest was smoking, the flesh charred black, but he was still standing, still functional. "Clever," Hans growled, his regeneration already working on the UV damage. "But the Millennium engineers accounted for your UV technology. We were built to resist it. Not immune, but resistant enough to survive what would destroy lesser artificial vampires." Blade pulled himself from the wreckage, running tactical assessments. UV ineffective, silver partially effective, regeneration too fast for conventional staking. He needed something that would overwhelm Hans's healing factor completely, something that would destroy the vampire faster than he could repair the damage. Behind Hans, Blade could see Seras struggling against Luke Valentine. The second werewolf was toying with her, using superior strength to keep her off balance, preventing her from bringing the Harkonnen to bear. She was fighting well, her police training evident in her tactics, but she was outmatched. "You're distracted," Hans said, and suddenly he was inside Blade's guard, one massive hand closing around his throat. The vampire lifted him off the ground with casual ease, his grip crushing windpipe and carotid artery simultaneously. "The Major predicted this. You're a hunter, yes, efficient, skilled, experienced, but you fight alone. You don't understand combined arms. You don't trust backup." Blade's vision was tunneling, his Dampier healing fighting against oxygen deprivation. Hans was right. He'd always worked alone, always relied on his own capabilities. Partnerships were liabilities. Teammates were vulnerabilities. But Seras Victoria wasn't his teammate. She was Helsing's asset, temporarily assigned as backup, which meant she wasn't his vulnerability. She was the enemy's opportunity. Blade stopped fighting Hans's grip and instead drew his pistol, aimed past the vampire's shoulder, and emptied the entire magazine. Not at Luke Valentine, at the support column of the building behind him. The structure collapsed, tons of concrete and steel dropping onto Luke's position. The vampire was fast enough to dodge, but Seras was faster, using the moment of distraction to put a Harkonnen round directly through his center mass. The explosion vaporized Luke's torso, leaving only legs and a head that was still trying to regenerate. Hans's grip loosened fractionally, surprise, not fear, and Blade took the opening. His boot knife, silver-edged and coated with EDTA concentrate, drove up into Hans's armpit. The strike found the major artery cluster, and the concentrated serum flooded directly into the vampire's cardiovascular system. Hans dropped him, staggering back as his regeneration stuttered. Impossible. The serum cannot. It can, if you deliver enough of it directly into the bloodstream, Blade rasped, his throat already healing. Your regeneration is trying to fight the serum, the UV damage, and the silver poisoning simultaneously. Even enhanced artificial vampires have limits. He drew his sword and moved forward. Hans tried to defend, but his enhanced strength was failing, his speed deteriorating as the EDTA disrupted the artificial vampire physiology at the cellular level. Blade's blade took the vampire's head in a single strike, and this time, the regeneration didn't activate. Hans Gunsche crumbled to ash, his enhanced body finally accepting death. Blade turned to see Seras finishing Luke Valentine with systematic precision, 3 silver stakes through the chest, EDTA injection, and a final Harkonnen round to ensure complete destruction. Her uniform was torn, blood staining her shoulder, but her hands were steady. "You used me as bait," she said, not quite accusatory. "I used the tactical situation to create an opening," Blade corrected, already moving toward the Parliament district. "There's a difference." "Master does the same thing," Seras said, falling into step beside him. "Uses everyone and everything as pieces in whatever game he's playing. I suppose all vampires think like that." "I'm not a vampire." "You're half vampire, and you just sacrifice someone else's safety to win a fight. That sounds pretty vampire to me." Blade didn't respond because she wasn't entirely wrong. The line between using his vampire abilities to hunt vampires and becoming the thing he hunted was thinner than he liked to acknowledge. How many more fights like this before the distinction stopped mattering? They reached Parliament Square to find it transformed into a war zone. Helsing forces had established a defensive perimeter around the building, but Millennium vampires were everywhere, hanging from lampposts, perched on statues, standing in organized formations that spoke of military discipline. And in the center of it all, standing on a platform that had been erected specifically for this moment, was a small man in a Millennium uniform, the Major. He was smiling, his arms spread wide as if welcoming them to a performance. Behind him, a massive screen displayed live footage from across London, Alucard's rampage, civilian casualties, military engagements. The invasion was being broadcast, documented, turned into spectacle. "Willkommen!" The Major's voice carried across the square through speakers, amplified and cheerful. "The Daywalker and Fräulein Victoria, I am so pleased you could join us for the climax of our little production. Tell me, have you enjoyed the war so far? Has it met your expectations?" Blade's hand found his sword grip. "This ends now." "Oh no, Herr Blade," the Major said, his smile widening. "This is where it truly begins." The artificial vampires surrounding the square raised their weapons in perfect synchronization, and the Major's laughter rolled across London like a promise of further violence. The battle for London raged for 7 more hours. By the time dawn broke over the Thames, Millennium's invasion force had been reduced to ash and memory. Alucard had carved through their ranks like a force of nature given malicious intent, consuming hundreds of artificial vampires and adding their power to his already incomprehensible strength. Anderson and his Iscariot forces had arrived in the conflict's final hours, and for once, the Catholic vampire hunters and Protestant monster wielders fought on the same side, united by the simple fact that Nazi vampires made every other supernatural conflict seem petty by comparison. And Blade had killed the Major. Not in dramatic single combat. The Major wasn't a fighter, just a fanatic with a dream of beautiful war. When the artificial vampires finally broke and scattered, when their command structure collapsed under combined assault from Helsing, Iscariot, and the British military, the Major had simply stood on his platform and smiled as Blade's sword took his head. He died laughing, as if the war's outcome had been irrelevant compared to the experience of orchestrating it. Now, 3 days later, Blade stood in Helsing Manor's courtyard as dimensional energy began to coalesce around him. The same fracture that had brought him to this universe was opening again, reality's natural correction pulling him back to his own world. Walter's instruments measured the phenomenon with scientific precision, but nobody really understood it. "So you're leaving," Integra said, not quite making it a question. She stood with her usual rigid posture, though exhaustion lined her face. London was still cleaning up the aftermath. Thousands dead, entire neighborhoods destroyed, and a supernatural community that would take years to stabilize. "The fracture's pulling me back," Blade confirmed. "I don't control it." Convenient timing. Integra lit a cigarette, studying him through the smoke. "Before we have to discuss what happens next, whether your crusade against all vampires includes the ones who helped save London." Blade looked at Ceres, who stood quietly beside Walter. She'd fought well, killed dozens of Millennium soldiers, saved civilian lives, acted with honor and courage throughout the battle. She was also a vampire who would exist for centuries, drinking blood, watching everyone she'd known as human die of old age. "I don't have an answer you'll like," he said honestly. "I didn't expect one," Integra replied. "But understand this, Mr. Blade. Your absolutism is a luxury afforded by someone who fights alone. The moment you accept responsibility for others, for a city, for a nation, moral certainty becomes considerably more complicated." "Maybe." Blade's hand rested on his sword hilt. "Or maybe the compromise is what lets monsters like Millennium think they have a chance. If every vampire was hunted with the same intensity I bring, there'd be no artificial vampire armies because there'd be no vampire mythology to build them from. And no Alucard to destroy them when they came anyway," Ceres said quietly. "You're good, Blade. Maybe the best vampire hunter I've ever seen. But you couldn't have stopped Millennium alone. None of us could have." The dimensional fracture was growing stronger, reality beginning to thin around Blade's position. He had maybe 30 seconds before it pulled him back to his own universe. "The police girl makes a valid point," Alucard said, materializing from the shadows with his customary dramatic flair. He smiled at Blade with something that might have been respect, or might have been anticipation of future violence. "You hunt efficiently, you kill effectively. You're everything a vampire hunter should be. But you're also predictable. You see vampire, you attack vampire, you destroy vampire. You can't conceive of a world where the monster might be the solution, rather than the problem." "Because it isn't," Blade said. "Monsters controlling monsters just means twice the body count eventually." "Perhaps." Alucard's smile widened. "Or perhaps you're simply afraid that if you stop long enough to consider alternatives, you'll have to acknowledge what you've always known, that you're more vampire than you pretend to be, and the only thing separating you from what you hunt is the story you tell yourself." The fracture opened fully, dimensional energy pulling at Blade's body. He had seconds left. "If I ever come back," Blade said, meeting Alucard's red gaze directly, "we'll finish this conversation properly." "I look forward to it, Daywalker." Alucard's voice followed him as reality began to blur. "Do try to survive whatever universe you land in next. It would be disappointing if someone else got to kill you before I had the chance." The last thing Blade saw before the dimensional fracture pulled him away was Integra's slight nod, acknowledgement of a temporary alliance ended and a future confrontation postponed but not cancelled. Then he was falling through the space between universes, London and its monsters fading into memory. He'd come to hunt vampires. He'd found a world where vampires served, fought, and died alongside humans against a greater threat. Whether that changed anything about his crusade, or simply proved that every universe had its own delusions about controlling the uncontrollable, That was a question he'd carry back to his own reality. But one thing hadn't changed. Vampires existed to be hunted. Whether they wore Nazi uniforms, served British intelligence, or wielded Catholic faith as a weapon, they were still parasites feeding on humanity. And Blade would still be there, in whatever universe he landed, doing what he'd always done. Hunting. The dimensional fracture sealed behind him, and London returned to the work of rebuilding. In Helsing Manor's courtyard, Integra crushed out her cigarette and turned to her assembled forces. Saras, Walter. Damage reports. Alucard, return to your usual containment. And someone contact the round table. We need to discuss how we're explaining a Nazi vampire invasion to a population that doesn't officially believe in vampires. Business as usual, in a world where monsters walked alongside humans and the line between protector and predator remained forever blurred. New worlds await. More stories soon.